Hello, welcome to the Commercial Awareness Compass. If you're an aspiring lawyer feeling overwhelmed about how to develop your commercial awareness, you're in the right place. This weekly guide is designed to help you build commercial mindset step by step. Each week, we'll be breaking down a major story to help you understand from three perspectives: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. By following along, you'll gain practical insights as you can use in your applications, interviews, and future career as a solicitor. Whether you're thinking about just starting out or looking to deepen your knowledge, this session will help you progress and think like a commercial lawyer. My name is Daniel Shepherd. I'm a law conversion student and a future trainee solicitor. I'm meant to act in your position, so I have no clue what the story is, but I'm here to learn, here to be curious, and here to find out what the story is today. And I'm fortunate enough to be joined by Emma Lilly. She's a in-house lawyer with expertise in commercial law, and Emma will guide us through today's story and share expertise, insights into business, and legal and strategic implications. So, hi Emma, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good, thanks, Dan. How are you?
I'm really good, thank you. So today our focus is on farmers' protests and what is known as the tractors tax. And as we go through this session, we'll explore the story from the three levels previously mentioned. So for those watching, I encourage you to engage at the level you're comfortable with and then challenge yourself to think deeper as we progress. So Emma, let's start with the basics. Could you explain this story to someone who's new to commercial awareness? What is happening and why does it matter in a broad sense?
Of course, I'll give it a go. Thanks, Dan. So, yeah, as Dan has kindly introduced for us, we're looking at the farmers' protests. Now, around 13,000, it's been alleged, farmers took to the streets of Westminster last week now. And some of them even brought their tractors along. So there was lots with the tractors in the centre of London, which made me giggle a little bit when I was reading about that. You can just imagine the sight. But they were protesting against proposed inheritance tax changes. Now, this has come as a result of an impact that the Labour government is trying to make. Of course, it goes along with their manifesto. But what they are doing is they're proposing new laws that would mean farmers pay tax on their assets. These demonstrations were huge. Jeremy Clarkson turned up. There's been a lot of public interest. But of course, this is going to have an impact on lots of different areas of law, areas of business, supply chains, and things like that, of which we can break down. Why is it important? Is because, again, as we'll see in this session today, lawyers at all angles will be touching upon this. It's interesting from a politics point of view, legal point of view, commercial, etc. There might be some things that we can break down, perhaps some key words, Dan, that will help us to go through this, but we'll get to discover them as we go along.
So, what could some of these key terms be to prepare ourselves for looking at the tractor tax?
Well, I can start with inheritance tax if that's helpful, because I know that
That'd be great.
yeah, there'll be people watching from different levels. Of course, you will look at this in a specific module at the LPC or SQE or whatever stage you're doing that at. But inheritance tax is, from a little bit of a morbid point of view, you might have heard it being called the death tax. So when somebody passes, you look at their estate, what they have and what they're worth financially. And if it's over a certain amount of money, which is called the nil rate band, I'll explain that one next, it might be helpful. If it's over a certain amount of money, then it's subject to inheritance tax. Now, this tax is taken by the state from the deceased estate, which means the amount of money left in the pot that goes to a beneficiary, I'll explain that one as well, is left, but it's taxed, so it's taken away from. So let's break that down a little bit further in this beginner stage. So we've got the inheritance tax. It's an amount of money that's taken on the final value of an estate. The nil rate band that I mentioned is an amount that you can have tax-free. So if your estate is worth up to the nil rate band, no inheritance tax is due. That currently stands at £325,000 per person. So if your estate is not worth more than that, so if you own a house that's say 200,000, so people might be looking at me thinking you've got to be living in the north if you're in a house of that much value. A house that's 200, you've got a car, maybe some smaller assets that don't add up to 325,000, no inheritance tax is due. That's got to be absolutely clear. Anything over that is taxed at 40. So it's not the overall balance, it's anything over 325. So if you're worth 425, it's the 100k that you're taxed 40% of, so 40k of that to the taxman. Beneficiaries, we also mentioned. Beneficiaries are those people that benefit from a will or from someone's estate once it's been through the process of probate, which is essentially just somebody tallying up the estate. That exercise we've just looked at can be more complex in some cases, as we'll get onto with farmers, but beneficiaries are those that benefit from whatever's passed down as a result when someone passes. So we've got inheritance tax that we've introduced, the nil rate band, and of course beneficiaries. If there's any more that crop up along the way, I'll explain them, Dan, as we go through, and don't be afraid to jump in and also say, can you explain that one, please, Emma? But yeah, those are some of the key terms that might crop up today.
So what are some of the issues that have stirred the imposing, if you wish, of this inheritance tax in order to kind of contextualise why this protest has started?
Very good question, because there's lots of different moving parts here. So I did briefly mention the Labour government, and of course, huge change for us in the history of the UK government that we've had, and a different strategy, a different look on the working class and protecting that, and then maybe looking at taxing the wealthy a little bit more. Let's put at a basic level. So you've got the political element to this. That's a big moving part. Labour are looking at how they can get more tax in from those who they think should be paying more of it, essentially. So that's the beginner's way of looking at that. You've also got the industry impact of supply chains. So, and we'll get into this, I'll just introduce it now, and then when we hop over to intermediate, probably shortly, I'll explain a little bit more about supply chains. But supply chains essentially is food in this context, how that goes around, how we are feeding people, how we are keeping society going, and of course, a lot of that comes from the farmers. And then also, I guess, as a societal thing too. You've got this divide of classes, and should farmers have more rights than others? Because the final thing I'd like to mention in this beginner's part is that farmers previously were exempt from inheritance tax. So any agricultural assets, if they could be linked to the farm, very basic way of saying it, but if they could be linked to the farming, the business of farming in the family, then it wouldn't be subject to inheritance tax. So you've got millions and millions of pounds worth of assets. If you can link it to a farm, it's not taxed. So historically, and still today, it's not yet changed, farmers have avoided inheritance tax because they've been exempt to it. So that's a societal thing that might change as well, Dan.
That's great. I think that provides a really good basis for the beginner level of this session. But now to move on to the more intermediate session, what is the connection between this story and, let's say, business and industries, and who does it impact? So could we maybe go on to explain how this issue specifically affects the legal sector or companies within the sector?
Of course we can. And again, I'll break that down a little bit more again in this part of the session. So the government I have here suggested, this is from research, this is where I'm reading it from notes, that an average farm last year made a profit of around £45,300. Now, when you're thinking of the size of an assets of farms, usually they're worth multi-millions. The whole agricultural kit, you've got all of the tractors, the machinery, just the stock, all of those sorts of things. You'd think it's a very expensive and lavish, apart from the mucking out and being in the mud all the time, but a lavish industry to be in, because we all see farmers as being quite wealthy. But when you look at that stat from a business and a commercial point of view, farmers already feel like they are being impacted and squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. We look at who they're being squeezed by, and you've got shops. Look at the huge retail supermarkets that are reporting crazy profits, in very high percentages. And they, of course, get their stock, their food, their supplies from farmers. And then what they do is then they label it and say, oh, British farmed or locally sourced, and they are making more and more money out of it themselves. So of course they're paying for the marketing on top of that. But into the context of this whole businessy and the commercial side of things and who might be impacted, you've got all of these different moving parts. Now, where that relates to a lawyer, all of these retail chains, individual farmers for private wealth and inheritance tax purposes, all of the different marketing spiels and the advertisements, they're all subject to legal implications. You've got laws and regulations. The Advertising Standards Agency, the ASA, dictate what supermarkets can put on things. And there's been a lot of also negative press around that side of things. So are supermarkets being totally honest with where they're getting them from? Are those laws and regulations strong enough? So automatically you can start to see lawyers might be involved at different places, Dan.
So, for what were some of the reasons in which a farmer would go about contacting a lawyer for this issue? So, what guidance would they be reaching out to a lawyer for this?
Well, there's things that individuals, farmers or not, can do to protect their wealth prior to them passing. So there's lots of things around exemptions, not just only agricultural, but different things you can do. So, for example, if you are married before you pass, your nil rate band gets, how to put this simply? So if, let's use me as an example, I'm not a farmer, clearly, but I'll say that I am. Say I get married before I pass, then my nil rate band gets multiplied by 2 because I've also got my spouse's. So anything that gets passed to my spouse is exempt, but also you've got the benefit of their nil rate band too. So, and that's this is not legal advice, and I don't operate in that area. But it's just an example of where a lawyer can help an individual and really go into those complex details of saying, well, what's your whole estate look like? Are you married? Do you have any dependents? Is there anything that we can do from a legal point of view that's above board, of course, you would hope, that's above board, to make sure that we can mean you aren't impacted by this as much as you would think is written in the news lines. And the better the lawyer and possibly accountant, then the more relief that they'll benefit from, because somebody that knows the law and works with it and finds all of these ways to make sure, of course, everything's above board, but maybe they can divest their estate in different ways, might be an advantage. An example of that is if you dispose of certain things within so many years of your death, it's also exempt, so you can pass it down. There's gifts that you can give up to a certain value per year if somebody gets married. If you have a wealthy relative, Dan, I don't know if you're married or not, but if you have a wealthy relative, before you get married, they pass you a load of money over the fence, and you might be wondering why. There might be a lawyer behind that. Who knows? So there's lots of different things that a lawyer can help with as regards that. But then also, as said, you've got the big businesses. So not only the individuals and the farmers side, which they might be working in their own big limited corporations that are all connected globally. You might have a head farmer somewhere. But those aren't the ones that are really protesting. Then you've got the big corporations as well that will also have their own internal lawyers, perhaps looking at all the different impacts of this.
Now, you've just mentioned the types of farmers that would be protesting. Also, it would not be protesting like the big corporations. What types of farmers are protesting in this, and what are they addressing as their main arguments against this tax?
So the ones that I've seen mainly are protesting are the ones that are saying, we can't afford for my father, mother, uncle, like we can't afford for them to pass because we can't afford to pay for the inheritance tax. We would have to sell the farm to make sure we can pay the tax bill, in which case the business is gone. And if that impacts a lot of smaller farms, then the farming industry collapses. And then as a result, no food, no quality food in the country. We can't say British farmers, British farmed anymore, British beef, all these different things. So those are the kinds that are saying, yes, we might be sat on assets that we might be asset rich because there's a band to this as well. So up to £1 million worth of assets and above are taxed, anything under. So they've got to have a farm that's worth over £1 million to be caught by the proposals. Again, that's draft, which is why I pause, because it's not yet decided yet. But let's say it's decided that £1 million and over farms are taxed. To me, that sounds like a really rich person has property that perhaps should be taxed just as anybody else would be if they had £1 million house. But they're saying, well, if we then sold the farm, then that would impact our whole future. And then we're all, farming goes on for many, many it goes all the way through the family tree, doesn't it? Usually, Dan, like when you see things are handed down and just the expertise gets passed. So then the argument is, well, we'll lose all of that expertise, the knowledge, and then we will be impacted much more than what you're saying we are. So I would say it's mainly those middle range that are saying they're going to be the impacted the most.
And I think it's probably important to address. So with the final stage of the intermediate part, are a lot of the arguments coming from more a cultural and societal perspective, or a broader economic and legal perspective, like from the farmer's point of view?
Interesting question, because of course we're here today to make the legal links, and if I was looking at it objectively, I think a lot of it is cultural and financial in terms of the kick up that we've been seeing. But then we know by attending this commercial awareness compass and by talking through topics like this that there's always a legal part behind it. So let's use Jeremy Clarkson as an example. His recording of his speech in London, his calling for the government to do a U-turn, you've got to reverse it, you can't go through with it anymore. He doesn't mention, from what I've seen, any legal jargon, anything to do with that. But behind all of it, he's going to be very well informed. There are allegations that he purchased his farm to get out of paying inheritance tax on his assets, because if he didn't invest in a farm and he would have bought a property instead, then he would have had to have paid inheritance tax on that estate when he unfortunately passes and it goes on to his family. So there's arguments that he knows what's going on behind that, whether he bought his farm to get out of this or not, or whether he's a genuine farmer, as is shown on his TV program. I'm not sure, but there's always a legal spin behind it, and I guess that's a very good point for us to move on to the advanced stage.
Yeah, so I think that's a great way to wrap up the intermediate stage. So now moving on to the advanced stage, if we look at it from a strategic position, for law firms that are advising clients on the farming tax, how might they help not just with compliance, but also position farmers for a more positive outcome if this was to be put into action? So obviously at the moment it is a draft, though. What could law firms be doing now to set farmers up for success in that position?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, you've got to stay up to date with the law, because if until legislation's in, it's not in. So at the current, as it stands, agricultural assets are exempt from inheritance tax. So at the moment, if a farmer passes and his estate is calculated, then it's not relevant. If you were a lawyer that was advising on this and made that mistake of thinking that it was in now, then the whole legal advice is shot and it's incorrect, because the law hasn't yet changed. So it's about knowing the difference between what is proposed and what is actual in legislation. And to be able to do that, you've got to be quite skilled, of course, at research. You've got to know where to look on the Gov website, and keeping up to date with the politics angle as well, making sure you're up to date with any publications, because I doubt it from my point of view, but Labour might still reverse this, or they might change. I give the cap of 1 million, that might change, it might flex a bit, who knows? So there's lots of different moving parts. So the first thing that a lawyer should be doing is making sure that they've got the facts straight, because it's a moving thing. We could have done this in a week's time and things might be completely different. Protests just bring things to the front, don't they, and add the public interest. So research. And then it's also, when you think at the right time that it's worthwhile advising clients that they might want to be doing something about it, that's the key. Because there's lots of competition in this legal industry. You know how many law firms there are, Dan, how many lawyers that we have that will be specialists in inheritance tax. So you need to make sure that you're ahead of the competition as well. And thinking of the law firm as a business too, if you need to get clients, retain clients, and make sure that they're staying loyal to you, you need to make sure that you're hot on with your advice with the right timing. If one law firm comes out first to their potential client base and says, you need to think about X, Y, Z, we can do ABC for you to make sure you're not impacted, or let's have a conversation, and then lawyer B leaves it too long, and gets the timing wrong, they've potentially lost that client and that revenue they could have got in. So thinking about it from a wider commercial awareness perspective, that's something else I would think about too. But getting into the actual nitty-gritty of it, of course, you've got the lawyers who will actually be working on the wills, and wills that are in place at the moment. Are they clear enough? Do they have relevant capacity, which is, did the person that created it or signed it, is it valid as of when they entered into it? All these different things. So you've got pre and post passing, I guess, is a way to look at it with the legal aspect. But I guess if you like, Dan, we can talk about the commercial side as well in terms of the supply chain, if you think that's relevant to do now.
Oh, absolutely. So, from a commercial perspective, obviously farmers offer a huge part in supermarkets and shops and other areas. What are the areas that are going to be most affected by this commercially?
It could drive costs up, couldn't it? And looking at it from a macro point of view, so by macro, I mean a high up business looking down, like strategic, lots of different elements coming into it. From that point of view, if we get less access to food in the country, you've got to think about more imports from elsewhere. So perhaps we're into EU and international law here now as well. Those different agreements that are signed between countries and governments to make sure we've got access to food. There'll be lawyers involved there. You'll have to think about the cost of living crisis that we're already in. So all these different moving parts will impact the commercial way of purchasing food, selling food, quality checking food, all the health and safety things that go into it. And there will need to be a lawyer behind every contract and every agreement that goes behind all of those things. So maybe a huge commercial impact on the economy, the supply chains, where we're getting things from. I think it could have the potential to have a knock-on effect in a number of different areas of law and business, this one.
You mentioned earlier that on average, farmers make around £45,000 worth of profit a year. And if these sort of farms aren't able to afford legal fees, that could create a huge shift in the market on who is able to capitalise or benefit, or who is going to be most subjugated to these changes. Do you have any opinions or views on that?
Oh, it's a great angle of looking at it, to be honest, because then again, you've already tapped into this law firm client relationship. And yes, more farmers might be needing legal advice, but who's going to provide it? I think it's quite a complex area of law, isn't it? Inheritance tax, as we've only explored and touched the surface today in terms of the legal and legislation that goes behind it. So I think you'll still need experts. And you're right in terms of who has access to that. Is that going to be impacted as well if people's belts are going to be a little bit tighter as a result of, feeling like they have to fear for the financial future? Me personally, if I was the shareholder of a law firm, I'd be thinking about different ways that I could look at fee arrangements for these in particular clients. And I don't have experience of this. This is just me pondering as to what I would do, as to just the knowledge of how the law firm as a business works. But there's different fee arrangements that would come into the way that you offer clients advice. If you could package up a fixed fee advice line or guidance for a farmer that is impacted or could potentially be impacted by this in future, and charge it, let's say I'm going to say, right, 10 grand, and I'll give you all of these different things. I'll answer all of your questions. You might not get a one-to-one regular call with a lawyer, but there's all the information that you'll need if you want to follow up. I'll make sure that it's charged at this fixed fee, or maybe you get one call within that package. And then think about the way that you could commercialize that as a law firm. It's already, it's like an off-the-shelf bit of legal advice. That's, something creative that you could think of as well. And I guess for those that are watching back in the interviews and things like this, you can ask questions around, fee arrangements for clients, who decides the strategy around them and the pricing, and asking about billability and things like that, because it just shows that you're linking something like tractor tax to how a law firm and how the legal industry operates. And I think that's really clever. So I'm glad that you've got on to asking that question, Dan.
Well, it's quite an interesting thought, because in times where you have a lot of people who maybe can't afford expensive legal representation, but there's that many people wanting that representation. You see with a lot of, let's say, maybe an outdated version, but like PPI, like you saw that people were bringing together thousands and thousands of claims to a singular firm, and they were able to kind of spread those claims and advice across a lot of people. Do you feel like a similar sort of structure could be seen with farmers, or that kind of offering, I guess, of legal services?
I guess time will tell, won't it? We'll have to
Yeah, of
see
course.
how the stories evolve, what law firms do to react to this, who's going to serve the clients, who ends up on top as a result of this potential change in law, and how the story develops, I guess.
Because there's also the other side of it of other corporations who may be interested in, like large forming corporations who would maybe benefit from the changes of the tractor tax, with, let's say, other farms being taken over in that sort of instance, who probably have the resources to pay for expensive legal representation.
Well,
You,
hey, if you think about these small farms, Dan, I think you're spot on. Sorry to interrupt there. If you think about these
no,
small
you're fine.
farms, if a huge corporation could sweep them up because a farmer is concerned about having to pay tax, then they might as well get the value for it whilst they're alive and think about different ways of diversifying their income and their wealth. Then somebody might sweep up and do well out of this. There's always two sides to it, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. So as the current protests stand, so we have obviously the implication of the tax and how that's going to affect businesses and corporations. What about the protest in itself? Has that had any knock-on effects commercially?
So there are. So first of all, from a legal point of view, as we're in advanced, I'll skip straight to there.
Thank
Um,
you.
so there are different regulations around protests about them being peaceful. Of course, there's a human right to be able to do this, but there are lots of different points that go into it. And as we've seen from different levels of protests around different things, some that are, a lot more sensitive than the one that we're talking about today. There's been different discussions around should they have been allowed to go ahead, who's involved, things like this. So you've got all of those going on, and perhaps if some community or somebody organised it, they might have reviewed the regulations and what was permissible as well. We'd have to make sure that we had adequate security and adequate police, just because of the number of people, potentially 13,000 it was stated. So there's things like that. Commercial implications of protests, perhaps businesses might have been impacted whilst the footfall and the tractors were there. If they were in front of, a shop, say a tractor parked in front of a bank or one of like H&M on the high street, and then H&M complained that they didn't have the footfall that they should have done in a huge week before Black Friday. There's all these different things you can think about. There might be some complaints there as well. So yeah, some great examples of some ancillary impacts that things like this can have.
That's great. So now that we're nearing the end of our advanced section, do you have any further ideas on where you think that this will go, how this will affect the legal industry, and more ideas on how this affects commercial awareness overall?
How will it impact overall? I think it's a good example, this, of something that shows you can be commercially aware without realizing it. So you might have people that are interested in this sort of industry or not, but then we've realized through the conversation that we've had today how it impacts lots of different areas like communications. Lawyers are touching upon it from all different angles. We've even discussed marketing. So I think that's a really good introduction to how something that you might think in the news isn't going to be relevant to me for commercial awareness. It absolutely is. And then I think also what I would take from this is the importance of keeping up to date with a story too. Because again, if you're listening to this today and you have an interview, or per se we were in interview season and you listened to something or you read an article and you went into an interview the next week and didn't just refresh your mind on what had happened, the position could be completely different. The things are the same. The underlying commercial awareness techniques that we've discussed today and will continue to do so in the Compass will continue to stand. But it's just making sure that just a 5-minute check of an update, because things do move so quickly, will put you ahead of the competition. So if you've done that and something changed 24 hours before, and you can show that in your applications or in your job, in what you're doing existing, then it's a really great skill to have as well. So that's something that I would take to the future.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that is a really important point, especially with stories like this, where it is so fast paced. There are so many changes in both policy and public perception, and what the outcomes may be. Constantly checking and refreshing, especially prior to having an interview. I think it'll put you in a really, really good position. So thank you so much, Emma. I really appreciate you for your time. It's been absolutely amazing. And thank you to everyone else who's been listening today. So, thank you for joining the Commercial Awareness Compass. So, everyone should remember that commercial awareness isn't just about staying on top of the news. It's about understanding why events matter to clients and how you, as a future lawyer, can provide strategic value. So, whether you're just starting out or already have some understanding, the key takeaway is to approach every story with a curious, analytical mindset. Always ask yourself, how does this impact clients, and what would a law firm do to help? Join us next week to keep building your commercial awareness. Until then, prepare without the panic. Thank you.